What have you been obsessing over?
Well, and the biggest news story, of course, is the imminent attack on Iran, which is looking increasingly likely. Again, nothing is certain, especially when you're talking about Trump. But we're putting all the pieces in place. There are constant reports, a steady stream of reports of air assets, for example, being moved into the region. Meanwhile, the USS Gerald R continues to steam towards the Arabian Sea and is due to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, I believe, sometime tomorrow. So it's well on its way. And then there was a report that came out, I think it was in Reuters the other day, and then again in Axios today, that the U.S. is anticipating a weeks-long war, something anyway that really looks like a war. They and Axios is saying that it's imminent. It's going to happen in the next couple of weeks or very few weeks.
How do they expect to keep it?
90% chances. That's how they calculated.
But how do they expect to contain it to a week? Why would they see a weeks-long war?
Yeah. Well, again, I don't really know exactly, I am just dependent on other experts, but most people seem to think that they have maybe enough missiles on their ships and maybe enough aircraft to actually conduct a pretty intensive campaign for at least 2 weeks or up to 2 weeks. But then there would have to be some sort of lull. Now, maybe they've worked something out. I don't know. I guess it looks like actually they understand that Iran is a real risk and Iran can hit back. And that's why they're putting so many assets into the region. And I expect the hope is that they're going to try to knock them out, quickly with that first blow, or do significant damage to their air defense capabilities and their offensive missile capabilities. So I think, again, what happens in the first couple of days is going to be extremely important. Will they succeed in doing that, or will Iran this time have the intelligence, maybe because of radars and other equipment supplied by China and Russia, to respond immediately, even not just wait to take the blow, but to send their own missiles flying when they see the incoming aircraft. Oh, again, I think it may be those first 2 days are going to be critical, to the outcome of this war.
But it just seems impossible. We've talked about this before. Iran is 3 times the size of Ukraine. We have seen Russia pummel Ukraine for years now, and somehow Ukraine is still standing. So it's just, how do they expect to be able to knock them out in 48 hours a week? It's just, surely there are people, these are professional military men, right?
Right. Now, there are some ways, the comparison with Ukraine is valid to a great extent. And in fact, you could even argue that, what do we say is not 3 times, but even 4 times the size of Ukraine, because if we look at it, Russian-occupied Ukraine versus Ukrainian-occupied Ukraine, those are I think the territories that really matter. And all of Russia versus, Ukrainian-controlled Ukraine. And what 3 times the population, really. So that's an important comparison. But there are some differences that I think we have to keep in mind, and that is that this is a ground war, and the Ukrainians are still on the ground. But if we're just talking about an air war, well, the Russians did manage to pretty much wipe out the Ukraine's offensive air capabilities in the first few days. They destroyed much of their air force, and then they sank their fleet. But of course, Ukraine still had this ground army. It still had extensive air defense, but it had a complete, legacy system that had been left by the Soviet Union that was really very effective and was nationwide. And it took a long time for the Russians to degrade that and eventually to destroy that. It took, well over a year. Iran doesn't have that kind of air defense. Again, maybe I don't know. A lot of it comes down to how well protected their missiles are. How can they survive, a massive and sustained air attack by the U.S.? I think they probably can, again, but we're just, we're relying on these reports. We know that they've been preparing. They understand what the U.S. has. They've created these underground cities. And so I think that they're going to be able to survive it, and they will be able to continue to fight this air war. So, yeah, again, the U.S. can do a great deal of damage no matter what. They can kill people. They can destroy a lot of equipment and so forth. But if you're going to measure the success of a war effort, you have to look at the objective. And the objective clearly here is regime change here, regardless of what they say. Again, the nuclear stuff is just is a red herring. That's not something that's supposed to be gone, according to Trump, and now he's going to blow up the dust. Okay, this is all very silly. It's about regime change. I think we all know that. And if at the end of the day, when the dust settles, okay, the Iranian government is still there, and they have inflicted some significant damage, on the Americans and on the Israelis, you'd have to say victory goes, it's a painful victory, but a victory to the Iranians.
Yeah, I just don't understand how you could say that that the U.S. military could say that it would just be a week or a couple weeks campaign, because sure, you can maybe pack up your boats and steam them back and say that's a victory, but you have military bases, these permanent installations that are there. And even, let's say you were able to wipe out all of their ballistic missiles, which I think is impossible. But even if you did, there's still, the militias in Iraq and throughout the region, as well as these drones that they could use to just pummel these bases. They can't just say, oh, it's over. We hit you really hard with all we got. Now don't do anything back. We're in their territory. We're in their backyard. They will kick us out, and they will keep on hitting Israel too, right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Again, it's actually, it's going to be more than a couple of weeks. I think we would need to, or some of the ships would have to go back to Diego Garcia, for example, after 2 weeks to reload. But Reuters, again, was talking about a week's long, probably more than 2 weeks. It's 3-4 weeks. Who knows what that may turn out to be optimistic. We don't know. Yeah, and then also you think about the Houthis. The Houthis were firing missiles up until the end, and that was when, a reason that the ceasefire, we declared victory and went home, right? That's what Trump did. And again, the Houthis have a lot less than the Iranians, and they're shooting from a much smaller territory. Yet, and we definitely were trying to degrade their missile capabilities, but we failed. So, if that is any sort of let's say a test case, an indicator of what's to come, and I think it certainly should be, it just doesn't look good. But clearly they're going to try it. They're going to attempt it. And, maybe they have some trick up their sleeves. We have to admit in the past we've been surprised by things they've done. They are creative people in these defense departments, and especially within the intelligence communities. But it just doesn't look very good. We'll just say that, for the U.S. military as far as actually attaining their objective. It just seems very, very unlikely.
Yeah, I go back and forth about whether or not it's possible that we can get some type of negotiated settlement, because I think Trump and many people in the Pentagon understand how dangerous this is, how suicidal this is, and they want an off-ramp. And, and clearly Iran doesn't want this either. Iran and the United States, this huge conflict that's looming, neither one of these parties wants to do it. And so it just feels like, well, then surely we can avoid this absolute catastrophe that we're just marching into. But, even Reuters, you say, or Axios saying 90%. I mean,
Yeah.
Is
Well,
there
who
any
knows?
chance?
Well, there's a possibility, for example, that 90%. Okay, let's look at it from a different vantage point. Maybe Trump really has no intention of doing this. Maybe he really understands how disastrous this would be. And this is exactly the sort of thing that he wants to avoid. It's what he criticized George W. Bush for Operation Iraqi Freedom. He said it was a disaster. And I think he really understood that or understands that it was. So let's say that Trump really understands that this could be a disaster, something that could really sink his presidency. So what's in that case? What's going on? Well, Trump always uses mafia tactics to negotiate, right? And maybe that's all this is. Okay, I so for let's say even the 90% that figure that appeared in the Axios report. Perhaps that was leaked purposely just to put pressure on the Iranians. That's not impossible. Again, there's all kinds of things going on behind the scenes. And you hear that the negotiations apparently are going ahead and they're talking about real things, about how to control the uranium, the enriched uranium, actually maybe having it stored in Russia at a certain point in its cycle, that kind of thing. So there's always a chance. It's not impossible. There's always a chance that a deal can be reached. And we know that it can be, because one was reached in the past. And they could do it again. It's something the Iranians have always said, yeah, we're willing to deal on this. In a way, they would have a point if they said, no, why is it that we have to do this? Nobody else is subject to these really strict, inspections, this really strict, regime, uranium enrichment regime. Why is it only us? And say, forget it. But they have shown a willingness over the years. Yeah, we will deal on this, okay, so that you don't have an excuse to attack us. We do have a right to enrichment, but if you are truly afraid that we're going to create nuclear weapons, we will allow you to have very intrusive inspections and have other means of, safeguarding the process, preventing denying us a breakout capability. They're willing to do that. They did in the past. They did it again. A previous administration agreed to it. So it could happen, right? It could happen. And maybe there will be some sort of twist. And that difference will be what Trump says, okay, see, this is why, my deal is so much better than Obama's. His was the worst deal in history. Mine is the best deal ever in history. This is great. And now the ships can go home. That was part of my very, very, art of the deal, my negotiating tactics here. We put on the pressure and they caved in. Maybe they didn't really cave in, but he'll claim that, and then he could declare victory. Let's hope. If he does that, more power to him. But again, it's just that you assemble all this force, and you have these very, let's be honest, very incompetent negotiators. Real estate moguls who don't know anything about any of this. But maybe you can get enough experts in under them, and actually get a real deal hammered out. And meanwhile, and Trump can somehow just plug his ears and stop listening to the Tom Cottons and Lindsey Grahams and Netanyahu's, who are constantly pushing to him, suggesting that if he does, he actually does make a deal, then he will have given a victory to the Iranians, and he'll proven that he's not a real man or something, that he'll just won't listen to all of that and will go ahead. I don't think the odds of that are very good, but it's not impossible.